The Baltic forests in early May were a strange mixture of rebirth and ruin. Birch trees burst with young leaves, their fresh green shining against the dull gray sky. Yet the ground beneath them was still scarred by trenches, shell craters, and the blackened ribs of burned wagons. Spring struggled to reclaim land that war had tried to devour. For the men of Army Group Courland, this landscape had become both cage and refuge. They had defended this pocket of Latvia for months, encircled but not crushed, suspended between hope and hopelessness. Even as Berlin fell, even as the world declared peace, the Courland pocket clung to its last breath of resistance. In a shallow trench near the village of Priekula, Obergefreiter Lucas Hartmann crouched with his back against the damp earth. The air smelled of wet pine needles, old gunpowder, and the faint sweetness of approaching rain. He was only 23, but the trenches had carved a decade into his eyes. "Think it's true?" murmured the man beside him, Gefreiter Emil Bauer, his voice a low rasp. "The rumors? Berlin gone?" Lucas didn't answer immediately. The rumors had been flying for days. Hitler dead, Berlin surrounded, Berlin lost, Himmler negotiating, Göring fleeing. Every hour brought a new version. Finally, he said, "If it's true, we'll know soon enough." "Or maybe we won't," Emil gave a bitter chuckle. "We never know anything in this damn pocket, cut off like dogs. If someone blew up the Reichschancellery itself, the message wouldn't reach us until next winter." Lucas didn't smile. The truth was too sharp for humor. He brushed mud from the edge of his rifle's stock, though the weapon had not been fired for days. Across the trench, Lieutenant Weber sat hunched over a map, his face hollow. Orders had stopped making sense weeks ago. They held positions no one cared about anymore. They patrolled lines that led nowhere. Behind them, the forest groaned with the shifting wind. Birds sang cautiously, warily, as if they didn't trust the calm. Emil glanced upward. Strange, isn't it? Birds coming back. Nature trying to pretend none of this happened. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment. The song of a blackbird drifted through the air, light and trembling. It sounded impossibly innocent, a reminder of a world before the trenches, before the endless retreat, before the deaths that piled up like broken branches. "It'll never be the same," Lucas said softly. "Not for us." A crackle of static broke the fragile moment. Lieutenant Weber snapped to attention, the receiver of the field radio pressed to his ear. Yes, Herr Hauptmann. Understood." Weber lowered the receiver. His face had drained of color. "What is it, sir?" Lucas asked. Weber hesitated, swallowing once. Then he said, "Berlin has fallen. The Führer is dead." The trench went silent, utterly, completely. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. "What happens now?" Emil whispered. Weber's answer came slowly. "We wait for orders from General Hilpert, and, whatever they are, we obey." The house in Osa, commandeered as headquarters for Army Group Courland, had once belonged to a Latvian schoolteacher. Its walls were built from pale timber, patched with new boards where artillery fire had splintered them. The windows rattled in their frames whenever distant explosions rolled across the horizon. Inside, General Karl Hilpert stood at a table littered with maps, handwritten reports, and fading possibilities. His uniform, once immaculate, was worn, its collar pressed but fraying, its medals dulled by months of field grime. The weight of responsibility hung over him like an anchor. He had commanded men through battles he never wanted, through strategies he did not design, through orders that grew more desperate and detached from reality with each passing month. Now the world had shifted irrevocably, and he had to decide how to face what came next.
A colonel entered, breathless. "Herr General, confirmation from the Leningrad front. They are demanding unconditional surrender of all forces in Courland." Hilpert's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a cracked wall clock. He dismissed the colonel and sank into the nearest chair. For a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, just long enough to feel the exhaustion stretching all the way to his bones. He had known this moment would come. He had prayed it would not.
Back in the trenches, Lucas watched as the next order arrived, this time not in whispers, but through the trembling voice of Lieutenant Weber. "All units are to cease offensive operations," Weber said. "We are to maintain defensive lines only." "Defend what?" Emil muttered. "Dead trees and swamp water?" Weber ignored him. He held a small paper in his hands, its type faint from poor ink. "Berlin has capitulated. The Reich is finished." No reaction, no gasps, only the steady patter of rain beginning to fall on helmets. "And," Weber continued, "General Hilpert has entered negotiations with the Soviets. Surrender is likely within hours." Emil exhaled sharply. So that's it then. Lucas stared into the forest, where mist hung low between the trunks. After everything, this is how it ends. They all knew what surrender meant: captivity, uncertainty, years in camps, perhaps, or worse. But despite the fear tightening his stomach, Lucas felt something else rise within him, a strange, hollow relief, the kind that comes when the worst storm of your life begins, finally, to subside. On the night of May 8th, under a sky bruised with clouds, Hilpert rode in a staff car toward the Soviet lines. The car's headlights were dimmed, almost useless in the darkness. But the path had been marked earlier by a reconnaissance staff. The engine hummed quietly, the only sound in the dead, heavy air. Hilpert's adjutant, Major Kruger, spoke softly. "Sir, if we surrender, over 200,000 men fall into Soviet hands." "I know," Hilpert said. "They're looking to you. Many still believe in a breakout, a last stand, something." "A last stand?" Hilpert turned his gaze out the window. "Against an army that surrounds us 6-1? Against a Reich that no longer exists? Against a world that is trying to end a war we are prolonging only through stubbornness?" Kruger swallowed. Hilpert continued. "The war is over. What remains is our duty to the living, not the dead." The car rolled to a stop before a small Soviet command tent, lit inside by a dim lantern. Rain pattered on the soft earth. Hilpert stepped out into the cold night. By 11 p.m., the papers had been placed before him. He signed. His signature was steady. His heart was not. "This," he whispered, "is for my men, not for the Reich." Outside, thunder rumbled, a distant artillery barrage, its final echoes fading. On May 9th, the Soviet artillery fell silent. Patrols stepped forward through the trees without firing. Red Army soldiers emerged from the mist like ghosts, young, weary faces, men who had fought since Leningrad, many of whom had lost entire families. The Germans watched them approach with mixed dread and resignation. Lucas stood at the trench line, rifle slung on his shoulder, not as a weapon, but as a burden about to be shed. A Soviet sergeant, barely older than Lucas, approached with his hands visible.
"You throw weapon," the sergeant said in halting German. "All weapons, now." Lucas nodded. For a brief moment, he held his rifle in both hands, feeling its weight, remembering its history, the marches, the battles, the friends lost, the nights it kept him alive. Then he laid it gently on the ground. Around him, the soldiers of his unit did the same. Rifles clattered. Machine guns were dragged out and stacked. Mortars dismantled. Ammunition poured into piles like sand. For the first time in years, Lucas's hands were empty. A strange shiver ran through him, not fear, but release. Emil exhaled shakily. "Feels like losing part of myself." Lucas shook his head. "Feels like finding something."
By midday, endless lines of German soldiers stretched toward collection points marked by Soviet sentries. Their boots shuffled through mud, their steps slow, heavy, defeated. No one spoke. No one dared to. Every so often, a Soviet officer walked down the column, checking documents, recording units, separating officers from enlisted men. Lucas walked beside Emil, neither saying a word. Their packs were minimal, only what they could carry, though most of it would soon be stripped away. "Never thought it would end like this," Emil murmured. No one did. Ahead, a Soviet T-34 tank sat idle, its turret rotating lazily to scan the forest. Behind it, rows of captured armor were being catalogued by Soviet crews. Stugs, Panzer IVs, half-tracks, some still intact, their engines quiet, but capable of roaring back to life if commanded. "Look at all of it," Emil whispered. "Months of fighting, bleeding, dying, for them to just take it all." Lucas didn't answer. He watched the Soviet soldiers climb over the captured tanks, marking them with chalk, laughing among themselves. They were not mocking, they were celebrating survival. Perhaps they deserved to.
In Acer, 42 German generals stood together in a large barn cleared for the purpose. Dust hung in the air, shimmering in shafts of sunlight that slipped through cracks in the roof. General Hilpert stood before them, pale but composed. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly, "the war is over for us. The troops have surrendered. Now we must do the same." Not a single man protested. They were beyond illusions. Hilpert stepped aside as Soviet officers entered the barn. One by one, the German generals removed their pistols, their caps, their insignia, symbols of the authority they no longer held. The metallic clink of metals hitting tables echoed like funeral bells. When Hilpert surrendered his own sidearm, a simple Walther P-38, he hesitated only a moment before placing it gently into the hands of the Soviet major before him. The major nodded once with unexpected respect. "War is finished," he said quietly. Hilpert met his gaze. "Yes, now let us hope peace begins." By May 11th, the process was complete. 181,032 soldiers and NCOs, 8,038 officers, 42 generals, all now prisoners of the Soviet Union. The captured columns stretched for kilometers. Trucks, wagons, and tanks formed massive trophy lines. Soviet photographers documented everything. Proof of victory, proof of sacrifice. Lucas and Emil found themselves herded into a makeshift camp, surrounded by barbed wire and wooden posts. Soviet guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles slung casually, as though tired of their own weapons. Emil sank onto the ground. What now? Lucas looked at the sky. Clouds drifting across pale sunlight. "I don't know," he said. "But at least
The war is over. The makeshift prisoner camp near Jelgava spread across an abandoned collective farm. Once a place of harvest and quiet labor, it now held over 3,000 German soldiers behind barbed wire that had been hastily strung around the fields. Half-buried tractors and rusting plows sat like grave markers for a world the war had uprooted. When Lucas entered the camp with the others, the first thing he noticed was the smell. Damp earth, sweat, smoke from Soviet field kitchens, and the faint sourness of unwashed bodies that had marched too far with too little food. Soviet guards directed the prisoners into long lines. Some guards looked at the Germans with contempt, others with indifference, a few, oddly, with curiosity. Rain had begun to fall again, thin, cold, persistent. It drummed lightly against helmets and caps as the prisoners shuffled forward. "Remove belts," a Soviet sergeant barked. "Empty pockets. Place personal knives, lighters, metal items here." Men obeyed silently. They were too exhausted to argue. When Lucas entered the camp with the others, the first thing he noticed was the smell. Damp earth, sweat, smoke from Soviet field kitchens, and the faint sourness of unwashed bodies that had marched too far with too little food. Soviet guards directed the prisoners into long lines. Some guards looked at the Germans with contempt, others with indifference, a few, oddly, with curiosity. Rain had begun to fall again, thin, cold, persistent. It drummed lightly against helmets and caps as the prisoners shuffled forward. "Remove belts," a Soviet sergeant barked. "Empty pockets. Place personal knives, lighters, metal items here." Men obeyed silently. They were too exhausted to argue. When Lucas reached the head of the line, he removed his belt and placed it on the growing pile. Then he turned out his pockets, a short pencil, a thin notebook with smudged writing, a photo of his sister in Munich, a small silver cross given to him by his mother. The Soviet sergeant picked up the cross and inspected it. His eyes softened for a moment. "Family?" the sergeant asked in halting German. "Yes," Lucas said, surprised. The sergeant nodded and returned the cross to him. "Keep." Lucas blinked. "Thank you." The sergeant looked away quickly, as if embarrassed by the small kindness. Behind Lucas, Emil muttered, "Looks like you made a friend." But Lucas didn't smile. Kindness in war felt dangerous, like something fragile enough to shatter under the slightest pressure.
The days fell into rhythm quickly, the way misery always found routine. At dawn, the prisoners were woken by shouted orders and the distant clang of pots from the Soviet kitchen. Breakfast consisted of watery kasha served from dented metal drums, sometimes with a crust of bread if supply wagons had arrived that morning. Work details were assigned next, repairing roads, clearing debris, digging new latrines, carrying logs, unloading supply carts. The Soviets were strict, but not consistently cruel. Discipline varied from guard to guard. Some wanted only obedience. Others seemed to release their anger on the prisoners with any excuse. A few merely wished to return home themselves and treated the Germans with weary detachment. Lucas worked silently each day, lifting logs, hauling water, and repairing fences. His thoughts often drifted. Emil stayed close, finding grim humor where he could. One evening, as they sat against the fence, watching the sunset stain the sky gold and crimson, Emil nudged him. "You ever think what happens after this?" Lucas shrugged. "We go where they send us." "Siberia?" Emil asked, half joking, half terrified. "Maybe, maybe not." "What if they keep us for years?" Lucas didn't answer at first. The thought gnawed at him as it did all the prisoners. After a moment, he said quietly, "Then we survive years. That's all we can do." Emil sighed. "I wish I had your calm." "It's not calm. Just nothing left to lose." Emil stared at him, then looked away. They didn't speak again until the sky had turned fully dark.
General Hilpert was transported separately with other high-ranking officers. The Soviets kept them under closer watch, not out of cruelty, but because their surrender held political weight. Hilpert sat in a small wooden cabin, part office, part cell, with a single cot and a table. A Red Army major brought him tea each morning and allowed him limited writing materials. On the fourth day, the major entered with a folded newspaper. "From Moscow," he said. Hilpert accepted it silently. The front page announced Victory Day, featuring photographs from Berlin and Moscow, cheering crowds, Soviet banners, wrecked German armor, smiling soldiers. The major hesitated. "War was long. We lose many, millions." Hilpert met his eyes. "We all lost." The major nodded slowly. "Yes, all lost." He left Hilpert alone. The general stared at the newspaper for a long time before placing it aside. He opened his notebook and wrote, "The guns have fallen silent, but silence is heavier than noise ever was. I pray that our men are treated fairly. I pray that we are allowed to live out whatever time remains to us with dignity, though dignity is hard to claim after defeat." One rainy afternoon, Lucas and Emil were assigned to help unload crates from Soviet supply trucks. The mud sucked at their boots, and their breath formed faint clouds in the chilled air. While lifting a crate marked with Cyrillic letters, Lucas noticed someone watching him. A Soviet soldier leaning against a truck, smoking. The same sergeant who had allowed him to keep his cross. The sergeant approached slowly. "You work hard," he said in rough German. Lucas shrugged. "Work keeps the mind quiet." The sergeant nodded thoughtfully. Then he extended his cigarette case. "Smoke?" Lucas hesitated. Accepting a cigarette from a guard felt dangerous, like crossing an invisible boundary. But refusing felt equally dangerous. He accepted. "Thank you." The sergeant lit it for him. "Name?" "Lucas. Lucas Hartman." The sergeant pointed to himself. "Sergei." They smoked in silence for a moment, watching the gray sky begin to break open toward evening. "You have family?" Sergei asked. "A sister. In Munich. I don't know if she is alive." Sergei inhaled deeply. "War takes all things. My brother died in Leningrad. My father, too." Lucas lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." Sergei shrugged, not dismissively, but with the resignation of a man who had carried grief far too long. "My war is over, but pain stays." He finished his cigarette and flicked the butt into the mud. "You," Sergei said quietly, "keep cross. You remember." Lucas nodded. Sergei walked away without another word. Emil sidled up beside Lucas with raised eyebrows. "Making friends with the enemy again?" "He's not an enemy anymore," Lucas said. "Maybe," Emil muttered, unconvinced. But Lucas had seen something in Sergei's eyes. Something reflective, fragile, painfully human. A week into captivity, Soviet officers began interrogations of officers and NCOs. Most were brief, confirming names, units, ranks. Some lasted hours. Some ended with men being taken away and not returning.
Whispers drifted through the camp like smoke. Anyone in the SS is finished. They're looking for war crimes. My commander, they dragged him off last night. When Lucas's unit was called, his stomach twisted with fear, but the Soviet lieutenant asked only basic questions. Name: Lucas Hartmann. Unit: 329th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion. Rank: Obergefreiter. The lieutenant made notes. Front duty since 41. The lieutenant looked up. His expression was unreadable. Much fighting? Yes. You do bad things? The question struck Lucas like a physical blow. He stammered, I fought. I followed orders. I never hurt civilians. I did only what a soldier must. The lieutenant held his gaze for a long moment, as if trying to judge the truth. Finally, he nodded and waved him onward. Lucas stepped out of the tent with shaking hands. Emil met him. Well, I think it's fine. For now, Emil said grimly. For now was all they had.
2 weeks after the surrender, the camp grew quieter. The guards seemed less tense. The prisoners began to find scraps of routine they could cling to, washing clothes in the stream, sharing stories, carving small trinkets from wood. That night, Lucas lay on his bunk in the crowded barrack, listening to the distant chirping of crickets. For the first time in years, there was no artillery, no gunfire, no rumbling tanks. Emil whispered from the bunk below, "You awake?" "Yes." "What do you think your sister is doing now?" Lucas stared at the dark ceiling. "I don't know, but I hope she's safe." They fell silent. Outside, a faint breeze rustled the grass. And in that fragile, quiet moment, Lucas felt something strange, something he hadn't felt in years. He felt the future. Not a good future, not a clear one, not even a hopeful one. Just a future. And that was enough. The night of May 9th, 1945, stretched like an endless veil over the forests and low-lying marshlands of Courland. Although the war in Europe had officially ended, the silence that should have followed victory did not descend upon the front lines of the Baltic. Instead, the region echoed with a strange mixture of resignation, fear, and the last quiet groans of a dying military machine. Soldiers on both sides felt, in their bones, that something enormous had just passed through history, but its shadow still lingered in Courland.
On the German side, the remnants of the once powerful formations now resembled a ghost army. Trucks without fuel were abandoned along forest roads. Horses, emaciated from weeks of insufficient fodder, stood tied to fence posts or wandered aimlessly between shattered barns. Snowmelt made the earth heavy, masking the footsteps of tens of thousands of exhausted men preparing for the final act, surrender. Inside the village of Oeser, General Karl Hilpert, aged and worn thin, finished arranging his papers. His hands shook not from fear, but from the weight of duty. He had commanded men who knew they had no path left but to lay down their arms. For weeks he had hoped for some political miracle, an evacuation order, an armistice, an intervention from the West, but none came. Courland had become the last sealed pocket of a vanished Reich. Outside the building where the surrender document awaited his signature, hundreds of German officers stood in silence, forming a long corridor of shadows illuminated by lantern light. They did not speak. Many stared at the ground. Some looked at the sky, perhaps searching for meaning in the constellations above,
the same stars they had marched under years earlier when they believed themselves invincible. Hilpert signed at 2300 on May 8, but the consequences vibrated across the landscape only on May 9th, when Soviet units began moving to enforce the terms.
The morning of May 9th arrived in Courland with a thick mist rising from the damp soil. Soviet scouts from the Leningrad front, commanded by Marshal Leonid Gavarov, advanced cautiously. Though the surrender had been transmitted through official channels, no one trusted that it would be respected everywhere. The war had been too brutal, too unpredictable. Major Sergei Anatolievich Morozov, leading a small reconnaissance platoon, advanced down a dirt road lined with half-destroyed farmhouses. His men moved slowly, rifles ready, expecting an ambush at any corner. They had learned not to underestimate German units trapped in desperation. Yet what they found were not fanatics, but broken men. At the first major crossroads, they encountered rows of German soldiers sitting in the mud, helmets off, weapons stacked neatly in piles. An older sergeant approached, hands raised, offering a quiet surrender in halting Russian. Morozov accepted it with a nod and a curt gesture. The Red Army troops advanced further, encountering the same scene again and again. Lines of troops waiting in cold resignation, sometimes in companies, sometimes in entire battalions. Surrender had become a ritual of its own, repeated endlessly. By noon, reports reached Gavarov. Tens of thousands had capitulated, and the total was increasing by the hour.
In the German command posts, chaos replaced structure. Telegraph operators received a flood of last transmissions, fragmented orders, requests for clarification, pleas for direction. The chain of command dissolved with startling speed. Many officers burned their personal papers, fearing incrimination or hoping to protect their families. General Friedrich Wilhelm von Chapuis, commanding one of the key formations, walked into his operations room and found his staff standing silently, waiting for his guidance. Instead of delivering orders, he simply removed his gloves, placed them gently on the table, and said, "Meine Herren, the war is over." No one responded. For several minutes, they stood frozen, as if unable to process the enormity of the moment. The soldiers outside, however, understood all too well. They began dismantling barricades, cleaning their weapons to present them properly for surrender, and writing hurried letters. Some hoped their final messages might somehow reach their families before they disappeared into Soviet captivity. By the evening of May 9th, more than 80,000 had already reported to assembly points. But the true avalanche came between May 10th and May 11th, when the last pockets of resistance finally gave in.
The official handing over of the remaining forces took place under heavy Soviet oversight. Generals were escorted under guard to designated points. Many wore immaculate uniforms, as if trying to salvage dignity from ruin. Others appeared in worn field clothes, mud staining their cuffs and boots, their faces unshaven. General Hilpert, walking with two NKVD officers, looked neither left nor right. His face remained expressionless, but inside his thoughts churned. He knew that captivity for a man of his rank could last decades or end in trial. The Soviet interpreters read out the terms once more: immediate disarmament, organized separation of officers from enlisted men, and preparation for transport. Hilpert merely nodded. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a whisper. "The responsibility is mine. Treat the men fairly." The Soviet colonel beside him responded with a curt but surprisingly respectful reply. "War is finished.
Now the paperwork begins. As Soviet armored brigades advanced into the Courland pocket, they encountered what looked like metal graveyards, tanks with empty fuel tanks, self-propelled guns with their barrels removed or jammed, armored cars parked in endless rows awaiting abandonment. For Govorov's troops, this was an unprecedented haul of military trophies. Dozens of Panzer IVs, several Tiger IIs, Sturmgeschütze, half-tracks, artillery pieces, all left behind in surprisingly good condition. Soviet engineers marked and catalogued everything with practiced efficiency. A Soviet captain, standing on top of a hulking Tiger tank, remarked to his subordinate, "If only they had used all of this a month earlier, we might still be fighting." The soldier replied, "Comrade Captain, even metal knows when the war is over."
Columns of German soldiers, some stretching more than 2 kilometers, marched under the escort of Soviet infantry. They carried rucksacks with the last remnants of their personal belongings. Some marched barefoot, having worn through their boots in the final months of isolation. The roadways, filled with the sounds of shuffling feet, murmured conversations, and sobbing. The officers tried to maintain composure, but even they struggled with the uncertainty of their fate. The Soviets, for their part, remained outwardly stoic. Many had lost entire families in the war. Seeing their former enemies defeated brought a grim sense of closure, but not joy. By May 11, the surrender was complete. 42 generals, 8,038 officers, and 181,032 enlisted men had capitulated. The Courland pocket, one of the last bastions of Nazi resistance, ceased to exist. But unlike the celebrations in Moscow, where fireworks burst over Red Square, the Baltics remained somber, quiet, heavy with the knowledge that an entire army had ended not in glory, but in exhaustion. For the soldiers on both sides, survival was now the only objective. The morning of May 10, 1945, arrived under a sky the color of dull steel. The mist that lay across the Courland landscape was so thick that even the tops of nearby birch trees vanished into a pale blur. The earth itself seemed unsure whether to accept this new reality, a world where gunfire had stopped, but fear had not. As the sun tried to force its way through the fog, the remnants of Army Group Courland stirred from their makeshift camps. Soldiers rose from trenches, from barns, from dugouts they had carved into the earth during the last months. Many hesitated to move, staring blankly ahead, trying to comprehend what surrender truly meant. The war had ended, but the unknown had begun. A private's last letter. Private Johann Fiedler, only 19 years old, sat on an overturned ammunition crate near a ruined windmill. He clutched a pencil so short his fingertips brushed the wood. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what he wanted to say. He wrote slowly, carefully. "Dearest Mother, I am alive. The war is over. We will surrender today. Do not worry. Maybe I will come home sooner than I think. They say prisoners are treated fairly. I pray it is true. I miss our kitchen, your bread, the sound of the radio playing on Sundays." The pencil snapped. Johann let the broken stub fall to the ground. Tears rolled down his dirt-streaked cheeks, but he wiped them away quickly, ashamed. His sergeant walked by, paused, and placed a hand on his shoulder. A gesture so rare, Johann almost flinched. "Keep the letter," the sergeant said quietly. "If you can't send it now, send it later." But they both knew many letters would never reach their destinies.